Welcome, dear students. This is week number 9 of the course Programming Fundamentals with Python. In week number 7 and week number 8, we studied about different types of loops that are available in the Python language. For example, we have studied about the for loop and also the while loop. We also saw how the flow chart of these loops works, the syntax, what is the syntax of these loops, and different examples about each category of loop. We also see how we can use the continue and break statement inside the while loop and what is their purpose and how they work. Continue to the previous lectures. In this week, we will study about nested loop. So as usual, we will start our discussion with the objectives, what you are expected to learn at the end of this week, and then we will see the introduction to nested loop, critical aspects, what are nested loop, are the different categories of nested loop like the nested while loop, mixed. We will also have a look on the different examples that will demonstrate the concept of nested loop. For example, we will see how we can use nested loops to print different. So the objectives, here are the objectives. You will be able to learn about the concept of nested loops. More specifically, you will be able to learn what is nested for and also about the nested while. These concepts will enable you to write simple Python program that will demonstrate it. Now, starting with the nested loop. Did you remember where you have where you have heard the word nested in this course? If you revise the concept, you learned about nested if and nested if else statement or nested if else statement. So nested mean one thing inside another. So a loop that is inside the body of another loop is actually referred as a nested. So you can also say that nested loops are the loops where a loop will appear inside the body of another while loop or for when once we have more than one loop, so we have to refer to them by using specific name. So in the term of nested loop, the outer loop or the first loop is actually referred as the outer loop, while the loop which is inside the body of another loop is actually referred as an inner loop. Make things simple, the first loop is called the outer loop, while the second loop or the loop that you encounter first in the program is actually while the loop that you will encounter inside the body the loop is actually referred. The important thing to learn about the nested loop is how they actually execute. So it is important to remember that for any single value of the outer loop, the inner loop will complete all the all the passes, or you can say it will execute complete for each and every. We will see in a moment how it works, but for the time being, it is important to remember that for any single value of the inner loop will execute, or you can say that the execution of the inner loop will occurs for the execution of the outer loop. Okay, so uh, nested loops are important. They are used in many different types of algorithms. If you are familiar with the matrices in mathematics, we can actually use nested loops to represent matrices and also perform different operations matrices. Suppose uh, of a matrix, adding two matrices, multiplication of matrices, and things like that. Similarly, we can use nested loop in other application areas. One of the famous area where nested loops are applicable is to print different types of patterns, different types of shapes with the help of nested. We will see them in as well. So we have different types of nested. available. The first type of nested loop is called the nested for. As the name indicate, a for loop that is inside the body of another for loop is actually referred as a nested for. Here is the general syntax for the nested for loop. You are quite familiar with this syntax. We have seen this before in the for loop. So actually we have two for loops here. So that is why it's called nested, because we have one for inside the body of another for loop. The first for loop that we encountered in this program is actually an example of the outer loop, while the second for loop that we encounter here is actually an example of the inner for loop. And this is followed by a single statement or a group of statements. So here is the syntax. We have to write the keyword for, and then it is followed by a loop variable, which in this case is iterating variable. In is the keyword, and sequence you have to mention the range, and then it is followed by a colon. So this is one loop, the outer loop. The indentation in the second line means that actually the second for is inside the body of the first for, and this is an example of the inner loop. The syntax is same. You have to write the keyword for, is followed by a loop variable. In is the keyword, and sequence going to be the range of values. And then this indentation means that this statement or group of statement is actually inside the body of the inner loop. Remember, this is very important to understand that this statement or group of statements is actually part of the body of both the loops. Its execution will actually depend on the conditions in both the loops. So this statement or group of statement will be executed only if both the conditions are true in the outer and in the inner loop. However, if you see at this statement, the last statement or group statement, it is actually not part of the inner for. It is actually part of the outer for loop. So the execution of this statement or group of statements is actually dependent on the condition that is mentioned in the outer for loop. It has nothing to do with the condition the inner for loop. But it is important to note how the indentation works inside the body of the nested loop. Let us see an example which will also demonstrate the concept of the nested for loop and also its syntax. As I just mentioned, in the nested for loop, we actually deals with more than one for loop. But the number can be vary. It could be 2, it could be 3, it could be. There is no limit on the nested loops. However, the more loops you are, the more complex the logic program is, or the more difficult your code is going to interpret. So here in this case, we are actually using two loops. The first loop is the outer loop. The second loop, inner loop. Here we are using a variable I, which is the loop variable. In is the keyword, and range, as I mentioned, is the number of times that you want to execute this loop. 3 actually means 0, 1, 2, 3, because normal way is to start the variable with a 0. You can also change the initial value of this loop variable, but by default the value is similarly the case of j variable, which has a range of 4, which means the initial value of this variable is 0, and then 1, 2, and 3. So this loop will execute 4 times starting from, and print, as we know, is a function which will actually display the current value of I and the current value of A. Remember the indentation? This indentation means that the second for is actually inside the body of the outer for loop. And the indentation in front of the print function actually means that this statement is inside the body of the inner loop. Once it is inside the body of the inner loop, it means it is also inside the body of the outer loop. So this statement will be executed as long as the condition in both the loops. How things work, I will try to demonstrate the concept here. We have a variable I. The initial value this variable is 0. our outer. Check the condition here. 0 less than. Condition here is true. It means that we have to execute body of this because the condition is true. But inside the loop, we have another loop, and this loop is actually the inner loop. So here the value is also a loop variable. Start from check the condition. 0 is less than. So we have condition true here. Condition is also true because 0 is less than 4. Once the condition is true, we have to execute this statement. What does this statement do? It will actually print the current value of I. The current value of I is followed by the current value, and the current value. Okay, one thing which is very important for you to remember is that after execution of this print statement, take the inner case I mentioned just before that. First, we have to complete the execution of the inner, or you can say that for one value of the outer, we have to execute the inner loop completely. So go back to the inner loop, increment the value of j by 1. Now the new value of j is 1. Check the condition. 1 is less than 4. Yes, condition is true. So we have to execute this statement again. Now remember, the value of I is same, that is 0. But now the current value of j is 1. It will display 0, and again go back to the inner loop, increment the value of j by 1. The new value of j is, check the condition. 2 is less than 4. Yes, the condition. Okay, come and execute the print statement. It will display the current value of I and the current value of j. Go back to the inner loop, execute it for another time. We'll increment the value of j by 1. The new value of j is 3. Check the condition. Is less than 4. To execute the print statement, it will display the current value of I and the current value of j. Again, back to the increment the value of j by 1. The new value of j is 4. Once the value of j will become false. What is less than 4? Now here the condition is false, so we will not execute. Okay, so what will happen? Will the program terminate? No, because we, after execution of the statement, we now have go back to the outer. What will happen now? Here in this outer for loop statement, increment the value of I by 1. This value of I, the new value is going to be the condition. 1 is less than 3 condition. Once the condition is true, we have to execute this loop again. So this is going to be like this. And similarly for other items. So this is important to understand how actually the sequence, or how actually the flow works in case of nested. Could be nested for loop, or it could be a nested while. To elaborate further the concept of nested for loop, let us consider a general example from our daily life, and that example is based on the concept of, you're familiar that the clock actually has three hands: the second hand, the minute hand, and the hour hand, and they all spin around the face of the clock, we can say in clockwise direction. However, the clock hand only makes one revolution for every 12 of the minute's hand, and it takes 60 revolutions of the second hand for the minute hand to make one revolution. To represent the clock with the help of a nested, let us start first by representing only the second hand of the clock. We know that there are 60 seconds in a minute, so the range here is 60, which means 0 to 9. After 59, we have to increment the value of minute 1 second. After every 6 seconds, we have to increment the minute hand by 1. So this is how it says that for every minute we actually have to execute this loop 60 times. And how many minutes do we have in an hour? That is 60 minutes in it. Our next nested loop is going to be now we have 3 nested loop to represent. In this case, this is our outer loop, this is our inner loop, and this is our inner loop. Or you can say, you can define it in other ways as well. For example, uh, inner sub inner loop or inner loop, you can this way as well. But this is our outer loop, this is our inner loop and innermost loop. Or you can say this is inner loop. For this inner loop, this is our outer loop, and for this outer loop, this is the outer. What will happen here? For each value of hour starting from 0, this loop will be executed time, and then for each value of minute starting from 0, this loop will actually execute time, which means that in every hour we have 60 minutes, and in every minute we have. But first, this loop will execute completely for a single value of this loop. So it means that first we have to complete the seconds 0 up to 59 for the value of minute, which is 0, and also for the value of hour, which is 0. After the completion of this innermost, the value of minute will be, and after 60 iterations the minutes, this value will become, which means 1 hour has now. So if you run this program, you will see the complete of program. We will see the execution of this program in our practical week, the same lesson. Here is the flow chart by using which we can actually represent the clock problem. We have 3 loops as we saw in the program. So this is actually loop number 1, this is loop number 2, this is loop number. What is happening here? We are actually checking the condition, and the condition is the hour. So you can see from here the flow of this diagram, that once the condition become, we have to come to the inner body. So this is the body of the inner loop. But again here we have to check the condition, and the condition here is for the minutes. Once the condition here is true, then you have to the innermost loop is here, and the condition is for checking the seconds. If this condition is also true, then you have to execute what is inside the body of this innermost, which is to print the second value, the current second value, current minute value. Okay, from the back arrow, you can see that once the condition become false in the innermost loop, the control will go back. Here you can see control will go back to the out. Then again, we have to check the condition. If the condition is true, execute this loop once more. Back, check the condition. Once the condition is true, execute this loop once more time, and so on. The process will continue until we have the condition true here. Once the condition become false, we have to go out again. What will happen here? As long as the condition is true, we have to execute the innermost. But once the condition becomes false here in the inner loop, then we have to out this loop. And from here, we have to go back to the outer. What will happen now? We have to check the condition again. If the condition is true, execute the inner loop. If the condition is true, execute. Once the condition becomes false here, we have to go to the next statement, which actually followed by all these loops. Or if there is no statement, we have to terminate. So this is a graphical demonstration of how the nested loop. Just like the nested for loops, we also have the nested while loop. What is nested while loop? A while loop that is inside the body of another while loop is known as nested. So we have seen that nested for loop mean a for loop inside the body of another, while nested while loop mean a while loop inside the body of another. What about a nested loop where one loop is for and the other loop is? For example, a loop, a for loop inside the body of the while loop, or a while loop inside the body of a for loop. So you can say there is a nested mixed loop, but there is also an example of nest. So the general syntax for the nested while loop is the same as we saw the syntax of the simple while loop. But here the only difference is that we are actually dealing with multiple while loops. So here we have the outer loop is while is the keyword, followed by a boolean expression, condition check, and that is followed by a colon. And this is an example of outer loop. Here we can have a single or multiple statement, but that is optional. And then it is followed by another while loop, which is inside the body of the outer loop. So it is called inner loop, which is followed by an expression, boolean expression, followed by, and then the code to be executed. This code is actually inside the body of inner loop as well as the body of the outer. So this will execute only when both the conditions in the inner loop and outer loop are. Okay, so as I just mentioned that there are different application areas of the nested loop. One of the application area is to print different patterns. One of the pattern is here, and you are asked to write a Python program by using nested loop to print the same pattern. To solve these programming problems, you need to think over the problem. For example, here I have to give attention. How many rows actually have here? Total number of rows. Then how many columns do we have here? So we have a total number of 8 rows and a total number of 6. When you need to write a program where one loop have a range of 8. This is actually the range, and one loop will actually have a value 6 in the range. Here is the example. Column actually represent the number of columns. I have a total of 6 columns, and row actually represent total number of rows. As we saw, they are 8. Another thing that you need to observe in the problem that is given to you is to see which character has been used. So here the character is steric, so you have to use the character steric. If it is hash, for example, then you have to write hash here. And last but not the least, you give attention whether you have spaces in between the two characters. So in this case, we do not have any space. Have to write things like. And also, uh, one important thing to remember is the end parameter here. Print, we all know that it is a built-in function. It will actually display this steric on the screen. But after displaying this character, if you do not write this parameter here, then after printing this character just like this, the cursor will move to the next line. And once you execute this loop for the second time, the character will display on the new line. And after displaying this character, so I want to display this static on the same line. For that to happen, I have to mention an argument which is no and is equal to. Here you do not need to give space. This is actually the single quote, a single quote. If you give space in between these single quotes, you will see that the next static will be displayed after giving a space here, and then the next be displayed after putting another space. So remember, the correct way to avoid white spaces is to put the single quotes here. And is actually a parameter by using which we are telling the print function print all the state fine. So if you see here, uh, the initial value of row is 0, addition 0 is less than 8, will come to inner loop. Here the initial value of column is, check the condition, 0 is less than 6, yes, condition. It will come to this statement, this print static, and then after printing, do not go to the next, stay on this, and then go back to the inner loop, increment the value all by 1. So the previous value was 0, the new value is, check the condition, 1 is less than 6, condition again is true. Come to this print 1, and then it will happen 6 will display 6 statics. Once the value becomes 6, the condition will become false because 6 is not. So this statement will not be executed because the condition here become false. But then after execution of this statement, we have to this statement, because remember this is actually part of the outer loop. So for one value of the outer loop, that is 0, we have to execute all the things that are here inside the body of this for loop. So what does will print to? It will actually uh, bring the cursor a new line. Cursor will be on here, will be here on the next new line. How it works? Actually, this is logical. Uh, and is a parameter that we have to provide explicitly. But inside the print, there is a hidden parameter called base n. This is by default here. If you write it here, okay. If you do not write it here, doesn't matter. It is automatically put in here. It means that once the print function is in counter, it will move the cursor to the new, because of the hidden \n, which is an escape sequence, and the rule is to bring the cursor to the line. So the cursor is now here. After execution of this statement, go back to the outer loop, increment the value of 1, the new value is 1. Check the condition, condition is true. Okay, execute this time, execute this inner loop. How much time? It will print 6 more statics. And then once the condition becomes false here, we have to come here, we'll bring the cursor to the new line, then go back here and increment and so on. So this will display the static 8 times. We will get the output 8 rows and column. Here is another example. We also demonstrate the use of nested for loop. What's happening here? Actually, this program is the same thing, the same another version of the previous example. The only difference is that now the program is more dynamic. Instead of providing a fixed number, for example 8 as we saw in the case, instead of providing a constant number, for example 6 as we saw example, we are actually providing variables, and the values of this variable will come from users. Once you run this program, it will ask the user to provide a value for the rows and provide for the column. Let's suppose the user has entered 10 here and the user has, so this 10 will be assigned to the range, the 20 will as here all variable, and then it will the static 3 times. And how many lines? 10 lines. Example, here we have a different pattern. Again, to solve this programming problem, you have to think over the problem. First thing, number of rows, 1, 3, total number of 8. Number of columns, they are actually different. In the first column, we have a single static. In the second column or row, we in the third have 3 static, and to think it in order to develop the logic. Actually, this is row 0 because the index of the for loop, the variable will start from 0. Okay, so here how many static do we have? 1, 0 plus 1, and then here the value is 1 plus 1, and then next we have r. What does it mean? It means that every time we have to add 1 with the previous value of r. For example, total number of rows are 8. For each value of the column C, we have to add 1 to the r. So previously the value of r is, will add 1, then the value of r will be 1, then the value of r will be. To try this example, and we will also see the practical implementation of this program in the practical session very soon. Okay, next pattern. Now here the symbol is different. Instead of static, you have to use the hash symbol. Again, total number of rows here are 1, 5, 6, and the total number of columns. But what is happening here? Actually, at row 0, we do not have a space. At 1, we actually have a single space. At row 2, we have spaces, and so at the beginning of each character, you have to decide how many spaces do we have. So the pattern actually has 6 rows. In general, we can describe each row as having some number of spaces, which is followed by a hash character. So here is a row by row description. That first row 0 spaces followed by a hash character. Second row 1 space by a hash character. Third row 2 spaces. Fourth row spaces. Fifth row 4 spaces, and so the program is going to be like this. Total number of 6, and the range here is actually r. For example, if it is row 0, then do not print any space, and you can see here the end parameter as well. Actually, this represent the spaces. Okay, this represent a single space, and here we do not have any. So how it will work? For example, the initial value of r is 0. Come to the column. Here the value of C is going to be 0 as well. Okay. If row is 0, and for the value, initial value of C is also 0. So in this case, this statement will not be executed. False. Like this. 0 is less than 0. Once the condition is false, this statement will not be executed. We have to come here. So for the first time, you have to print a hash without any leading space. Okay, so go back now to the outer loop. Increment the value of r by 1. Now the new value of r is 1. The new value of r is 1 here as well. So c, the initial value of c is 0. Check the condition. 0 is less than 1. Yes. Once the condition is true, you have to execute this statement. What will happen here? Print an empty space. It will print an empty space. And then uh, place the cursor on the same line. Do not, we are dealing with a loop. Go back, increment the value of c by 1. Now the new value, check the condition. 1 is less than 1. Statement will not, but we have to execute this statement now. Now what does this statement mean? Print the hash sign in. It will print the here. You see, now we have an empty space followed by, and then after execution of this hash print statement, go back to the outer loop and the value of the inner loop. This is how the program. Example number 4, actually it demonstrates the concept of a list or the concept of array, which is also called array. Array or list is going to be the topic of our discussion for the next week. But what I want to explain from the program is that instead of the range, we can actually use the name of a list as well in the for. So you see, for is the keyword, x is the variable, n is the keyword, and here instead of using the range function, I am actually list. Similarly, the inner loop, for is the keyword, y is the variable, the keyword, and fruits is the name list here. So it is like this. The value of x will come from this array or from this list. So the first value is red, the second value is big, the third value is list. And for every value, as this is our out, for every value of this list, the fruits list will execute complete. So this is going to be like this. Once you run this program xy, it will print red apple, red cherry, and then big apple, big banana, and big tasty apple, tasty banana. This is how the execution. In this program, okay, guys, I will also do the practical implementation of these programs in the practical week. So just try to understand that here we are only focusing on the theoretical aspect. Instead of using for loops in this program, I am actually using nested while. Remember the difference between the while and for loop. In the for loop, everything happens in a single, but in the while loop, first you have to write the initial value of variable. For example, here the variable is I and the initial value is 1. Here the variable is j, its initial value is 5. Indentation means it is actually inside the body of the outer loop. This is our outer loop, this is our inner loop. What will happen here? First, it will check the condition 1 is less than or equal to 5. Yes, true. So it will execute this statement. Initial value of j is 5. Check the condition. 5 is greater than or equal to I. Yes, 5 is greater than or equal to 1. So it will display this statement which is actually inside the body of this inner loop, outer loop. It will actually display the value, the current value of j. So the current value of j is 5. It is 5 followed by this end parameter, which means stay on this line. Do not, again, as we are dealing with a while loop, so we have to provide incrementation or decrementation. So here is decrementation. Decrement 1 from the previous value of j. So the previous value of j was 5. Now 5 minus 1 here in this, actually 5 minus is 4. Okay, go back to the inner loop. Now the value of j is 4. Check the condition. Is greater than equal to 1. Yes, the condition. Come here and print the current value of j, and then 3 and then 1. Once the value become 0, it will check the condition here, 0 greater than or equal to, condition become false, then this statement will not be executed, this statement will not be executed. Have to come statement. What's happening here? Increment the value of I by 1. So the previous value of I was 1. 1 plus 1, the new value of I. Okay, And then after incrementation, print, which means backslash n, go to a new. And now we are here. Go back to the outer loop. The new value of I is actually check the condition, test and then execute the inner loop. And finally, we have two more programs, and that is about multiplication tables. We already saw programs about the multiplication tables by using simple while or for. But here we want to display several multiplication tables with the help of single program by using multiple state while or for loop. So again, we have a variable. The initial value is 1, range is 10. We have another variable j and 1, and the final value is 12. It will actually display the multiplication of I by j. For example, value of I is 1. The value of j is 1 by 1 is equal. And then for the same value of I, which is outer loop, increment the value of j by 1. Same. Do the same thing again. Outer loop is same, inner loop value up to 12 is equal to 12. Once the condition becomes false, here this statement will execute statement. Control will come to not. Here, increment the value of I by 1. The previous I was 1. Now the new value of I is 2. Check the condition. 2 is less than or equal to 10. Yes, true. Okay, now do the same thing again for the value of 2. It will now display the 2 table 2 by 1, then 2 up to 12. And then the table of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So this will display the 1 table, 2 table, 3, 5, 6 up tables up to 10. And this is another program which also demonstrates the concept of table, but here it is more meaningful. We will see the practical implementation program in the practical session. So this was about the nested while loop and nested for loop and how they are used inside the Python. Thank you so much. If you do not have subscribed to the channel, please do subscribe and stay tuned. Stay tuned. Goodbye.